And the study of heredity is quite old. However, we didn't always understand the idea of heredity, mainly because we didn't have the technology back then. But back then there was this dashing young gentleman named Gregor Mendel. He was an Austrian monk, and he decided that he wanted to study heredity. And what did he do? He performed a whole heap of experiments on pea plants in his vegetable garden. And while he was experimenting with these pea plants, he noticed that some pea plants that he observed were tall and some of them were short, even though they were growing in the same vegetable patch or same area, looked after the same way by the same person or the same group of people. So he thought that it was interesting that even though these plants were raised in the same method, that some of them were tall and some of them were short. He also noticed that some plants were different colors, even though they were grown the same way and looked after the same way. They were raised the same way, however, they expressed different physical appearances. And so, with those observations, Mendel suggested that the physical differences are probably inherited, meaning that these plants probably inherited their tall or short genes or the genes for colored flowers from their parents, from their parent plants. And so he suggested that these differences were probably inherited or passed on from generation to generation. Now you might ask, how did Gregor Mendel, perform these experiments? Well, he artificially fertilized these plants. So he artificially fertilized the plants by collecting pollen from one plant and cross-fertilizing it with the pollen in another plant. Now this allowed him to control which plants were mating with which plants, kind of like an arranged marriage. And it's probably worth noting now that Mendel came up with two laws from his series of experiments that we won't be going through in this lesson. And these laws are located down the bottom here. They're outlined down the bottom here. And we won't be going through them in this lesson, mainly because we haven't reached this to this level in school yet, in class yet. And if you're interested, if you want to go ahead and get ahead of this lesson, there are plenty of videos and websites and resources out there talking about these two laws. And you can go ahead and do that in your spare time. Okay, so Mendel cross-fertilized these plants. He artificially fertilized them by grabbing pollen from one plant and cross-fertilizing it with the pollen of another plant. And Mendel found that when he bred some plants with colored flowers, some pea plants with colored flowers, for example, he got purple plants and fertilized it with another purple plant. And he did this a series of times, many times, and he found that the 4 offspring produced by these two parents, the offspring were all the same. So he got 2 purple plants, he crossed them with each other, and the 4 offspring that they produced all expressed the same physical appearance. They all had purple flowers. And he tried that with white flowers as well. So he crossed these white flowers and these parents' white flowers, and he cross-fertilized them. And what did he find? He found the exact same thing. So he also found the same thing with the plants with white flowers. So he found that the offspring produced by these 2 parents expressed exactly the same physical appearances. And we call this sort of this kind of breeding true breeding. Okay? And what he did next was quite interesting. So in another series of experiments, Mendel tried something different. Instead of artificially fertilizing 2 of the same plants, he artificially fertilized 2 different plants. So he tried to breed 2 true breeding flowers, purple flowers with white flowers. And this process we call hybridization. Okay. and we call the two original true breeding plants parental generation, and the offspring we call the filial generation. And filial is just Latin for son. And the offspring we call the F1 or filial 1 generation, and filial is denoted by capital F followed by the number of the generation that the offspring are. So if these offspring produce more offspring, their offspring would be called F2 generation, and so on and so forth. And so in this F1 generation, Mendel found that all four of the offspring produced, but as a result of this hybridization, all four of the offspring exhibited exactly the same physical appearance. All four of them had purple flowers. Okay, so that's the F1 generation. And what he did next was he bred two of the F1 generation flowers. And what he found was that of the four offspring produced by the two F1 generation, the offspring expressed both purple and white flowers in a 3-to-1 ratio. We call this the F2 generation, and it's quite interesting. So, from the F1 generation breeding, of the four offspring, 3 of them were purple and 1 of them were white. Quite interesting. And to understand why this happens, there are 2 terms that we need to discuss. Dominance and recessiveness. And remember the word alleles? Now alleles means, if you don't remember, alleles means, the word alleles just means different versions of the same gene. And while dominant and recessive alleles, they're different alleles for a certain gene. So each gene will have a dominant or a recessive allele. And these alleles are found on the chromosomes. They have slight variation in the genetic code. So their code will be just slightly different. And the genetic code we call a genotype. So a series of DNA bases or a gene we call the genotype. And the genotype will dictate what is being expressed or what is being physically expressed. And the physical expression we call phenotype. Okay, and we didn't have the technology back then to really analyze alleles or understand what was happening. But Mendel, this brilliant young man, deducted that there were 2 alleles per gene. And true breeding plants must have identical alleles for a particular trait. And this brings us on to dominance and recessiveness. When Mendel crossed purple flower pea plant with a white flower pea plant, he found that its offspring only expressed a purple phenotype and not white. However, he found that in the F2 generation, there were both purple and white phenotypes being expressed. So this means that Gregor Mendel deducted that the genotype for purple flower petals must be the dominant allele, because that's what's being expressed. Whereas the genotype for white flowers were recessive because it's not being expressed, it's being passed on.